9 o'clock across the UK.
It is absolutely not fair on those people who lost sons and daughters and loved ones in that conflict, that they're still having to wait to understand how that fateful and, as I said, in my view, utterly wrong decision was taken in the first place.
The most talked about radio show is here. Call Clegg. Get straight through now. 0345 6060 973. Leading Britain's conversation. This is Call Clegg with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Only on LBC.
So it's time for Call Clegg with me, Nick Clegg, here on LBC, and I'm here as ever for the next half an hour taking your questions. So do call on 0345 6060 973 or email at nickclegg@lbc.co.uk, and you can watch on the website, lbc.co.uk. So let's go straight to the first caller, and the first caller is David in Bayswater. Hello, David.
Hi, Nick. I just wanted to ask you a question. How are you going to resolve the issue of the recruitment and retention of nurses, specifically British nurses who leave the profession very quickly, and the crisis in the A&E where patients are getting poor quality care and are dying in our A&Es? How are you going to resolve that?
Well, you need to recruit more nurses, and we are recruiting more nurses, and we've recruited thousands more nurses over the last several years. One of the ways, of course, you've got to do that is by making sure that we protect the funding for the NHS now and in the future. And a guy called Simon Stevens, he's not a politician, he's the sort of independent guy who runs the NHS on the country's behalf, has identified an £8 billion funding gap by 2020, and I think we need to fill that. And my party's come up with ideas about how you tighten up some of the loopholes in the tax system that only benefit the very wealthy, and make sure that we link the growth in spending on the NHS to the growth in the economy once we've dealt with the deficit to meet that figure. So you've got to provide money, you've got to recruit more nurses, and of course you need to deal with the very considerable, as you quite rightly said, David, very considerable pressures on A&E at the moment, not least by making sure that we have a more effective way of discharging elderly patients who can sometimes end up in hospital and end up staying in hospital beds for longer than is actually good for them, because it's because the social care system and the NHS system don't cooperate as well as they can together, which is why we're in fact, I think in a couple of months' time we're starting something called the Better Care Fund. It's a big pot of money, over £5 billion, which will allow the NHS and local authorities to sort that out more effectively than is the case right now. Are you a nurse, David?
Yeah, I am a nurse, and that doesn't resolve the problem. I said specifically British nurses. We are recruiting from abroad,
yep,
and we do this in cycles. I have been just over 12 years qualified. We recruited 10 years ago from Spain. We recruited 10 years ago from the Philippines. We then moved to Portugal. We are consistently moving around the world to find new nurses, because actually the care is substandard, and nurses who are British will leave because we feel guilt. We feel unhappiness. I feel sadness when I used to go to work in the NHS.
Are you now no longer a nurse, David? Have you left?
I am a nurse, and I'm still on the register. Do you know, Nick, the biggest issue I have, no nurse will speak out about this for one reason. Staffordshire is the reason. We spoke out, nurses spoke out and reported it, and you closed the hospital on your watch. So actually, you've taught me a valuable lesson. Don't speak out. Don't speak about the fact that actually people are dying today in A&Es around the UK, because when you're at the massive occupancy level that we are at, what happens is you miss things. And I've, over the years, have seen things that have been missed. And will we report it? No, because there's only one person in the frame, and that's the nurse and the doctor. No manager has gone to prison over their behaviour. No politician has ever been held accountable. So actually, the crisis is much more serious. And the reason I'm very angry is because it is so serious. And I do apologise if I come across a little angry.
No. Don't apologise at all.
I really care about NHS.
Well, it's obviously... it's well, I'll come in a minute to some of the things you've raised, but don't at all apologise for feeling passionate about something which is of such vital importance. Obviously, you care about it, but we all care about a properly staffed, a well-run NHS. Look, just a couple of points I'd like to make, David, is firstly, we do have a lot of nurses who come from other parts of the world, other parts of Europe to help out in our NHS, and I don't think we should somehow, I don't think we should, deny the fact that they do a great job. Lots of them do a brilliant job, and it's one of the reasons why I always think that if you did what UKIP say and large parts of the Conservative Party say, and just pull the drawbridge up, our NHS would collapse overnight, as would our social care system. But I think the point you're making is, how do we make sure we train more British nurses and people who want to go into nursing and live and come from our country? And as I say, more and more nurses are being recruited into the NHS. But secondly, how do we make sure that the pressures on the A&E, which you talk about, are sustainable in the long run? And look, I think there is a big challenge. We've now got, I think it's some statistics I saw recently, 2,000 more ambulance trips every single day, 3,000 more patients being treated within the 4-hour A&E deadline per day than was the case even a few years ago. And look, I've alluded to one of the things. I'd be interested to know whether, in your experience, this is one of the issues that certainly when I visit A&E departments and speak to discharge nurses in particular, they say that one of the biggest problems is not being able to have adequate places to move people out of hospital and back into the community as quickly as should happen. So these are things that do need to be sorted, will be sorted. I don't think that they can be sorted unless we provide the financial backing to the NHS that is necessary in the years ahead. But David, where do you think the source of the pressure on A&E is presently coming from?
Well, when you talk about, I'm not talking about the UKIP agenda, and I hate UKIP with a passion, because my wife is also a nurse and she's Irish, so she's on the people that they would want to deport or get rid of or put on a work visa. So I have no support for UKIP at all. But the foreign nurse issue isn't that we want to get rid of foreign nurses. The point being is, my parents came here from India. My parents were grateful that they came to the UK. I was born here. I am not grateful for what the UK has given me. I want more because I expect more, because I was born here. My parents were happy with the status quo. And that is the way many foreign nurses feel. Because if they express an opinion that says this is not safe, people tell them to leave. And I would ask you a question, Nick. In the last 10 years, why are we having to constantly run abroad? There is a systematic problem, a failure in the management in all of the NHS trusts that have to recruit in other countries. Because, I'll be honest with you, they treat nurses badly. And the biggest issue, the main reason I left wasn't actually, it was partly money, but the bigger issue was guilt. I went home, I had a man who was 92 years old. He was incontinent because of the fact that I took nearly an hour to get to him. The fact is, he started crying, and I felt bad because actually, you know what? You weren't there. Mr. Cameron is not there. I am the person there that is responsible for making that man cry, in my view, and that I couldn't cope with. And I got fed up with the guilt, going home feeling depressed about my job, and actually decided, you know what, I can go and earn a larger amount of income and actually not have a situation where I feel guilt every night.
Yeah, well, look, David, you put it very powerfully. I'm incredibly sorry to hear, not least for such a noble, if not the noblest vocation of all, nursing, caring for the sick and people who are vulnerable. It's very distressing to hear that you actually felt guilty about what you were trying to do, because you clearly were trying to do so, with the very best possible intentions. Look, things do go wrong. Things have gone wrong. You talked about Staffordshire. That didn't, I think you just implied it happened on our watch. It didn't. It actually happened under the previous government. But you're right. Then decisions were taken to make sure that it could never happen again. I very much hope that nurses listening to this would not feel in any way discouraged or intimidated for coming forward, where they think they've just got to kind of, be open about things that they think are going wrong. And I think the role of whistleblowers in the NHS, whether it's in A&E departments or anywhere else, are incredibly important, because unless people come forward and say what they feel, as you are now, we're not going to make things better.
All right, Mr. Clegg, is Ed Miliband weaponising the NHS in the run-up to the general election?
To be honest, I just don't really know what. I just don't know what Labour are up to anymore. I heard Andy Burnham the other day ranting and railing about having the independent sector and voluntary groups and, private companies playing some role in the NHS, yet it was the Labour Party that actually privatised. In fact, it was on his watch that private sector companies were shortlisted for the only privatisation of any NHS hospital, the Hinchingbrook Hospital in Cambridgeshire. It was the Labour Party that spent £250 million on independent treatment centres, basically private sector operators, to undercut the NHS. So they seem to be sort of arguing against their own record. They haven't actually come up with a plan in the way that I described earlier to meet the challenge set by Simon Stevens on how to deal with the financial pressures on the NHS in the years ahead. They haven't really fully endorsed what I've been doing to put mental health on the same footing as physical health. So, look, okay. I get the impression as a politician, and obviously as a leader of a different party, that what the Labour Party decided to do is they said, look, people care about the NHS, as they rightly do, more than almost anything else. Let's kind of just constantly and somewhat randomly point the finger of blame. And they haven't stopped to think about whether their own record measures up to their own criticisms, and it clearly doesn't.
We move to other callers. Where are we going, Deputy Prime Minister?
I don't know, because I haven't been given another name.
Well, let's go to Ida in Moore. Apologies for that. Just to explain, Mr Clegg is, again, the new age traveller of politics. He's going around the country. I think we find him in the West Country today. You're in Bristol.
I'm in Bristol, for a very good reason. Before you so facetiously describe what I'm doing, I'm actually doing something which I'm very, very proud of.
You travel in a dormer,
No, I don't.
No,
I don't. But just 20 seconds on this.
Yeah, of course.
Because I actually think it's really important. One of the things I discovered when I came into government was this all-pervasive view in Whitehall that Whitehall knows best. That, decisions about where you invest money locally should be taken by bureaucrats and politicians in Whitehall. And actually, I think it's a nonsense. I think local people, local enterprise partnerships, local businesses know much better about how to spend money to boost growth in the local area. So I'm announcing today £1 billion, which we've extracted from the clammy grip of bureaucrats and ministers in Whitehall and transferring them into the hands of local enterprise partnerships here in Bristol and elsewhere. And I'm here to rejoice in that great news and that great act of decentralisation.
The next call to
Are you lifted up, Nick?
I am hugely enlifted and feeling strangely empowered. The next call to Nick the Nomad is Ida in Morden. Ida, go ahead. You're through to Nick Clegg.
Thanks. Yes, hello, Ida.
Oh, good morning. I'm rather perturbed about where this £400 in vouchers is going to be given to these expectant mothers for giving up smoking. Now, that's all right in theory, very good. But the problem is with smoking, it doesn't only affect yourself. You affect others around you.
Absolutely right. This is the idea that women could get vouchers for stores such as Iceland and Argos, up to £400, £50 just for turning up if they gave up, pregnant women I should say, if they gave up smoking before becoming a mum. And subsequently, Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, your response?
I'm slightly perturbed by this as well, Ida. Not that it's not uninteresting that by providing people with those vouchers, those incentives, they might change their behaviour. I tell you what, I'm slightly perturbed by, Ida, is that where does this kind of end? Do you then give people cash in hand to just simply provide their children with a healthy regular meal? Do you then give people checks to make sure that their kids go to bed on time? And I tell you, so I'm perturbed, if you like, in the sense that at the end of the day, in any free, open, liberal society, yes, there are things that we've got to try and encourage other people to do, but we also have to just assume that people will take responsibility for their own lives and for that of their loved ones. And it's not for the state to kind of come up with ever more exotic ways of, in a sense, incentivising, or worse still, trying to bribe people to do what is good for themselves and their loved ones in the first place. And so, look, it's an interesting academic study. Do I think this is a blueprint for the way in which we should encourage people to do what they should be doing, for themselves anyway? I'm perturbed as well. I don't think it's the right way forward.
On the subject of individual responsibility,
yes.
the television personality Katie Price, it's been revealed in Wimbledon and back again by a minicab that's paid for by you and me off our taxes. Ms Price is believed to have somewhere in the region of £35 million in the bank. She says it's about £1,000 a day car journey. I'm rather surprised. It's probably about £200. Should the state be paying for that little chap?
I think it's for the local authorities to decide. The local authorities...
Well, you must have a view on the basic idea of it.
I'll tell you exactly what my basic idea is that I think there is a duty on local authorities to decide case by case on whether they help out with the costs of, in this case, the education of a disabled child. And in this case, clearly the approach they're taking is that should be available universally to children.
Someone with 30 million in the bank?
Well, we've talked about this before. We as a society think there are some things that we provide universally to everybody. I've just spoken to David about the NHS. We make the NHS available to everybody, paupers to multimillionaires, regardless of their wealth, based entirely on need, not on the ability to pay. And I think I totally understand it's a perfectly legitimate debate to be had about where you start introducing means testing or not. I so happen to think that the help that we give as a society to disabled children may well be one of those areas where most people think, on balance, it is better to provide that universally. Of course, it means you then get cases like this, Katie Price. But I'd be pretty reluctant to say on the facts of this individual case, we therefore throw out the idea of universally treating all children with disabilities with the same kind of compassion and support, everywhere we can. But as I say,
move closer to the school. Shouldn't she move closer to the school? If you're in an unfortunate position where you have a child who has a disability, and apparently there aren't many schools, and that's a whole separate conversation. This school is great in Wimbledon. Well, shouldn't you move within a 50-mile radius or 25? It's not much to ask, is it?
Well, look, we've just talked about, Ida was perturbed, as I am slightly, about the implications, at least, if I won't put it any stronger than that, of the kind of state taking responsibility through the issuing of vouchers for decisions that basically people should take as responsible adults themselves. In the same way, the implications of what you're saying, that somehow we should now instruct parents of disabled children to move house, I just don't know how on earth that would work, whether that's...
So you support Katie Price?
I do support... I support that. I'm not going to start now saying on the case of what I've heard about Katie Price's child, we should therefore throw out of the window the principle that local authorities can provide support to disabled children regardless of the income of their parents.
Now, down in the West Country...
By the way, it might have sounded inappropriate. I scoffed earlier when you said, but I thought you were going to start asking me about my own smoking habits again, and that's why...
I was trying to draw a veil over that.
No, I do. And you
want
did.
To go back
No, I don't. But
God's
I just
sake.
In case because
you're
I think,
obsessed about your smoking. I'm trying to move on.
All right,
you're battling the evil weed.
Let us move on.
I give credit for what you're doing.
Let us move
you
on.
are to be put on a pedestal. Week in, week out, you cut down the number of cities, and now you are mentioning it again. Where are we going next, Deputy Prime Minister?
Enemy. Kyle in Brockley. Kyle.
Morning. I'm just wondering, how do you feel about parties like Sinn Féin and SNP being able to prop up a government where they don't represent the views of the UK as a whole?
Yeah, because exactly, we've got all these. There's an absolute cottage industry now of speculation about whether Labour would do a coalition with the SNP, whether Nigel Farage and David Cameron would chum up together in Downing Street in a Tory UKIP coalition. I mean, I have to say to you, as someone who is, if you like, not the principal architect of this coalition, for people who don't like this coalition, just have a look at those prospects. The idea of Nicola Sturgeon or Nigel Farage, basically with the whip hand in Downing Street, I think would make the most fierce critics of this coalition slightly more benevolent in their attitude towards this coalition. Look, let's see what happens. I think the way in which the Labour Party appear to be sort of flirting or not flirting, depending on who you listen to, with the prospect of a coalition with the SNP, the way in which the Conservatives are, furiously both condemning and seeking to seduce UKIP, all pretty unedifying. Let the British people have their choice. I've been pretty open about the fact that I don't think those outcomes are great, nor, actually, as it happens, do I think a Conservative-only or Labour-only government would be great either, because the Conservatives would cut too much and the Labour Party would borrow too much.
Who's flirting with you, Mr. Clegg?
Well,
all this flirting.
Yes, I know. All this flirting.
All this eyes at Nicola Sturgeon and others. Who's rolling their eyes at you?
Well, I am valiantly and pluckily standing up for what this coalition government has done, much though the Conservatives are seeking to try and pretend that they somehow won the last general election on their own, which of course they did not. They don't like to be reminded of that. And I'm actually making the case, I'm being quite open about the fact that I think it's unlikely, alas, at least from my point of view, that I'm going to be the Prime Minister and that the Liberal Democrats are going to win outright. Mm-hmm. But if that's what the British people say, if they basically say through the instructions they deliver through the ballot box that they want to see Liberal Democrats around the cabinet table, which I, of course, think is a sensible thing, because I tell you, the Tories will cut too much, as I said. The Labour will stick their head in the sand about the deficit. Then, of course, that's something we'll look at. Not at all costs, of course not. I don't want Liberal Democrats to be in coalition just for the sake of it. I want to do it, as we did last time, for the sake of the country.
Now, while you go around the whole of the country, just about everywhere outside of Corby to avoid me, Prime Minister David Cameron did come into these studios earlier this week, and I told him about you thought that his concern to have the Greens take part in the debate was rather misplaced. This was his response.
He didn't want the Greens in the debates because, the Greens might take some of his voters away. Well, I understand that, but that's just his self-interest, and he's dressing that up as some high principle.
So the truth is you didn't want the Greens in the debate.
Well, since then, of course, the plot thickens, because having expressed this truly moving and touching, dewy-eyed compassion for the fate of the Greens, now David Cameron has said he's now equally worried about the fate of the DUP. I suspect next week he'll be worried about the fate of the monster raving Looney Party, and after that, when they're in, yes, possibly the Tea Lady. Why is she not in the debate as well? I mean, why don't we just have everybody? I mean, it's just getting ludicrous. This endless ducking and weaving, using other people as an alibi for avoiding something which I think is a simple, old-fashioned principle: is if you've been in power, if you run things, I think you should be held to account, and that's, of course, why, unsurprisingly, I think the Liberal Democrats, myself, should be able to be held to account for what we've done in this government, of course, as well as setting out our stall for the future.
I've got the solution. Get Noel Edmonds to do it and just call it Deal or No Deal. There could be 20 round of you round with boxes.
But the danger with this frankly increasingly sort of laughable way in which the Conservatives are sort of pushing the broadcasters to invite an ever larger cast of people is that, just imagine what it's going to be like for the viewing public. I mean, by the time everyone's done their 1-minute introduction, the whole nation will have switched over to Coronation Street. And so, look, the regulator, Ofcom, has said, I think they're still consulting on it, but they said, look, the main parties, under their definition, are the Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats, and UKIP. And I don't know for the life of me why the broadcasters don't at least include in one of the debates the main parties as identified, not by me, but the main parties as identified by Ofcom. Have the great smorgasbord one with everyone under the sun, if you want, as one of the debates. But surely the British people want to hear what, as an independent regulator has identified, provisionally at least, as the main parties. You want to hear them up against each other. At least it's also more manageable than this great family photo approach that the broadcasters now seem to be advocating.
Where are we going next, Deputy Prime Minister?
We are going to Chris in Hemel Hempstead. Hello, Chris.
Good morning, Mr. Clegg. I listened to Prime Minister's question times yesterday. It didn't sound as if many of the MPs were taking part in dry January. But to be serious, it has become an absolute farce. I mean, you're trying to encourage people to go out.
You try and sit there, Chris, I tell you.
It really shows the worst of MPs. Instead of behaving like statesmen, they're behaving like overgrown school children.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought this was all going to change.
Well, well, it clearly hasn't. No, listen, I mean, Chris, if you found it... did you listen or did you watch?
No, I listened.
Yeah, no, well, if you listen to it, just imagine having to actually sit there, as I do, week in, week out, not able to say my piece and listen to these folks sort of...
Why don't you take a book in?
Well, we did discuss this earlier, whether I should take a book or Danny Alexander tells me that Candy Crush is a great game. I could perhaps catch up a little bit on that, or help with my children's homework by looking at their homework schedule. Or there are a number of other more productive things I could easily do, but I suspect that. Well, look, Chris, you are basically right. Joking aside, I think it has descended into the most facile, yarboo kind of politics. That the only people who get excited about it are the people in the Westminster Village who sort of think this. The whole world revolves around who said what, who made what joke. The vast majority of the British public, if they listen like you, Chris, they're pretty unimpressed. Actually, the vast majority of people don't listen at all, and perhaps that is that's a blessing in disguise. Because I think if more people did see what happens every half an hour from midday to 12:30 on a Wednesday, they'd be even more kind of disillusioned about Westminster politics than many people already are.
We move on. Mr. Clegg, where do we go?
Mary in Finchley. Hello, Mary.
Hello, Mr. Clegg. Nice to speak to you.
Yes, nice to speak to you.
My question to you is, why was the winter fuel payment ever made universal? It is so misused. It should be for those pensioners on pension credit or the poorest pensioners to pay their winter fuel. Instead of which you find people shouting and screaming as to why they shouldn't get it. They're entitled to it. They might not even be in this country in the winter. Or they've got so much money they just spend it on more presents for their grandchildren.
No, Mary, look, I think I'll come kind of admit to what I think we should do, but you're not alone in this. Esther Ranson the other day was saying the same thing. She was saying she doesn't want poorer taxpayers to pay for her TV licence or for her her winter fuel payments. By the way, I think the bus passes is slightly different, and we were just talking earlier about when do you give a universal kind of benefit to people. I actually think bus passes for everybody, regardless, for those who retired, I think that actually makes a lot of sense. But on the winter,
Lord Sugar needs a bus pass.
He doesn't need it, but I actually think providing it for everybody universally, that does make a lot of sense.
Well, what's the difference between that and heating allowance?
Well, I think, look, because I think encouraging everyone, regardless of their income, who are elderly, to use buses, get out and about, be able to get to the shops, be linked to their communities, I think is a good thing. I think winter fuel payments and TV licences, I quite agree with you, Mary, and the proposal that my party's working on is a very simple rule. It's just saying that if you are rich and retired, in other words, if you're in the higher income tax bracket, and of all the people who retire, that's only 5% of people who retired, of pensioners, you shouldn't be asking much lower income folk through their taxes to pay for your TV licence or your winter fuel payment. And by the way, it's extraordinary that apparently, I think this is right, the Conservatives are now saying they'll protect these benefits for the very wealthiest in society, and then at the same time they'll clobber young people by taking housing benefit away from young people. How on earth is there any generational justice, yet alone social justice, in saying to the rich and the retired, we won't ask anything from you, but to ask young people who are trying to sort of start out in life and may not have got very much money to spend, oh, but by the way, we're going to yank housing benefit away from you. It doesn't seem to make any... And I have to say to you, it's going to be one of the debates, Mary, that I think is going to become increasingly interesting over the next few weeks between now and the general election.
What I find rather confusing here, Mr. Clegg, and you've always enlightened me in matters such as these, is that the Lib Dems are perfectly happy to allow Bruce Forsyth to get on the bus free, but they're not happy to give him some money to heat the house. Either we're helping elderly folk or we're not.
Yeah, look, Nick, I'm totally open with you. As we said earlier, there are things like the NHS, like help to disabled children, and in this case, bus passes to the elderly that we as a society decide that we're going to provide universally. And I think when it comes to bus passes, we should continue to do that. I don't think winter fuel payments and TV licence. I think for people who are amongst the wealthiest of the retired and by the way, I don't know about you, I find over and over again, Mary, sorry, I'm making perhaps rude assumptions about your age, but I come across a lot of people who, interestingly enough, are elderly and retired themselves, and they're the ones who object most to what they think is a slightly kind of... They're almost embarrassed because they say, look, they are mothers, fathers, grandparents, grandmothers, grandfathers, and they say, look, we want the younger generation to be looked after. We don't necessarily want money to be frittered away on help for us that we don't necessarily need. And that's why I think the Conservative Party decision of saying we're not going to ask the rich, retired to make any sacrifices whatsoever, but we're going to clobber the young and the poor. I think it is just the wrong set of values, and that's why I don't think it would be sensible at all to have the Conservatives in government on their own after May the 7th.
Let's try and do a final quick question and a final quick email. Let's do the question first. Do you have where we're going?
Yep, Stephen in Newcastle. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Nick. How are you doing?
I'm right. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Quick question. Relation to the Greek debt, is that they're going to try and renegotiate the schedule of payments, or indeed the amount they're going to pay. How is this going to affect our debt in relation to EU, or how is this going to affect our economy? Because it may have a knock-on effect, don't you think?
Well, I think what you're certainly right in saying, Stephen, is that any instability in the Eurozone, any kind of great uncertainty in what is our largest, by far our largest, export market, the European single market, the largest borderless single market in the world, any instability there, any lack of growth there, of course, impacts on us because we export so much of what we produce directly into the rest of Europe. We're not, of course, involved in these discussions between the Greek government and the rest of the Eurozone because we're not part of the part of the Eurozone. The thing I would reflect on, though, Stephen, is that when this coalition government here in Britain started out in May 2010, in fact, I vividly remember, I'm not sure if you remember, Stephen, in the weekend after the general election, our television screens were full of burning vehicles and violent demonstrations on the streets of Athens as the Greek people were grappling with the fallout of the economic turmoil they'd experienced. Actually, the British and Greek deficits were very, very similar at that time. Our deficit was about 10% of GDP. Theirs was around 11% of GDP. I think it's really striking that, fast forward 5 years later, they are in a real state of turmoil, and we are now growing faster than anywhere else in the developed world. And that shows how important it is sometimes to take, yes, difficult, maybe even unpopular decisions, but nonetheless provide the kind of political stability without which an economic recovery isn't possible. And I very much hope the differences between Greece and their Eurozone partners are sorted out, and are sorted out as quickly as possible, because, as I say, instability on our European doorstep is damaging to us.
One quick email. Jay, wondering what action your party will consider taking against David Ward MP. He's once again used Holocaust Memorial Day to impart offensive views on the immensely complex Israel-Palestine conflict. David Ward, Bradford East, I think it is, isn't it? Yeah, Bradford East MP. On Holocaust Memorial Day, he wrote, "It's imperative we share the memory of the millions who've been murdered in the Holocaust and subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Palestine, Bosnia and Darfur." Is there a genocide in Palestine? Deputy Prime Minister?
No, I don't think it is recognised that what's happening in Palestine, notwithstanding.
So what's going to happen to Mr. Ward? He keeps doing this. He's a
Yeah,
repeat
he does.
offender.
He does. He doesn't speak for the party, and I think this on that day of all days was a crass, offensive, insensitive thing to say. To compare what's happening, however very distressing it is, of course, to see what's happening in Gaza for the Palestinian people to what happened in Darfur or in Cambodia. Or, of course, to what happened in the Holocaust, I think is completely inappropriate. Is it something that people take offence for? Yes. Do I think it is wrong? Yes. But he doesn't speak for the party, and he never has.
All right. In the last few moments, news has come out that the number of secondary schools considered to be underperforming has doubled in the wake of a major overhaul of the exams system. Mr. Clegg, more than 300 schools fell beneath the government's floor target this year after failing to ensure enough pupils gained 5 good GCSE grades. This news released within the last 3 minutes. Much work to be done, Mr. Clegg.
There is much work to be done. I mean, I need to have a look at exactly what you're referring to.
Literally only just dropped, yeah.
Right. I think one of the things that you may be referring to is the fact that the way in which we judge schools' performances at GCSE level has changed. So, for instance, we do not provide the same weight in the way in which we judge schools' performance on IGCSEs as we used to, and that, frankly, has caught some schools out. When you change the measurements of school performance, you always get this sort of dip and change in the relative standing of schools. And partly, I think, what happens is that some schools just aren't aware that the benchmark by which they're being measured has changed, and then they adapt quickly and catch up. So I hope that what you're seeing is partly a reflection, not of schools suddenly slumping in the education they're providing to kids, but that they're just simply not yet attuned to the new way in which they're being measured.
Where is it next week? Pwllheli?
I wouldn't know. Such is the busyness of my travel schedule. I don't know where I'm.
As long as it's not Broadchurch. Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, thank you. Nick Clegg appearing here on LBC when news is next.
The Deputy Prime Minister has told LBC he believes the Labour Party is just randomly pointing the finger of blame when it comes to the NHS. Nick Clegg says they have no plan on how to deal with financial pressures on the health service.
I just don't know what Labour are up to anymore. I heard Andy Burnham the other day ranting and railing about having